Hi everyone, I'm Brandon Alinger from Prop Store, and I'm joined today by a very special guest, Charles de Lauzirika, who is a filmmaker and film historian. Welcome, Charlie. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Always fun to talk about Blade Runner.
Yeah, and you are, of course, the director of Dangerous Days, which is the definitive documentary on Blade Runner, and you're also a producer on Blade Runner: The Final Cut. Um, and you're here to talk to us today about a special lot that we have coming up in our auction, which is next to me here, an original Deckard shirt from the film, which is very cool, a very exciting piece to surface, and that we're very happy to be offering in our upcoming Entertainment Memorabilia live auction that's taking place in London. And I'm excited to have you here because you are a Blade Runner authority. You probably know as much about this film as anyone walking around this planet today. And so I know you'll have some interesting insights on the production and the wardrobe and how it all ties up together as a collectible. So why don't we start just by talking a little bit about your background and your background with Ridley Scott and with Blade Runner specifically. Can you tell us about Dangerous Days and about the Final Cut and what the documentary is, what the Final Cut is, and what your role was in both of those projects?
Wow, do you have like 2 hours to talk about all this? Because that's a lot. Look, it all began, June 25th, 1982. My mom took me and some friends to go see an R-rated movie called Blade Runner at the Man Hollywood Theater. And, my perception of what science fiction was had already been kind of evolved and changed because of Star Wars and Alien and quite a few other films. But Blade Runner took it to a totally new level for me, where it felt real. It felt like a real world, a real future that would be happening. It didn't, bits and pieces of it became real, but not all of it. Not the flying cars or the replicants, but it definitely kind of changed my sense of what science fiction filmmaking was. That it could be more than just pew pew and fun and action. It could actually have something to say, be artistic, artful, but also have some very interesting themes that you could kind of chew over. So after that, it definitely impacted me as a wannabe filmmaker. So I went to USC Film School. While I was at USC, I did a bunch of internships. One of those internships was with Ridley and Tony Scott's production company. And it just felt like a really good fit. So I was basically, associated with them for years. And part of that, again, went to a different level when DVD became a thing, when that started to launch and became very popular. And Fox was doing the first Alien box set. It was called Alien Legacy, was the first box set. And Ridley was leaving to go direct Gladiator. And because I was kind of like the DVD/science fiction nerd at the office, he asked if I'd be, I'd take over. I'd be in charge of it on his behalf while he was gone, and I did. And that began a long, series of projects and really great opportunities to work in sort of home video and behind the scenes and making of film documentation. So Blade Runner being such an important film in my life, I always had that in the back of my mind that as we worked on these various DVD projects, Blade Runner was going to be the one that I really wanted to get to. And eventually we did. It took a long time. And actually, once we started, it took a long time after that for a variety of reasons. But that began sort of a two-pronged process for me, which was one, Dangerous Days, producing a definitive, all-encompassing, epic documentary to tell the story about the troubled making of Blade Runner and the very interesting legacy that developed over the years. And then the other part of it was producing the restoration of the final cut of Blade Runner, which took a few years. So working on those simultaneously was kind of a dream come true for any Blade Runner fan, and I got to live that, and I got to go through all kinds of old archival materials and lost footage, deleted scenes, tests, all of this really, really great stuff. And then on top of that, interviewing so many people, on the cast and crew of Blade Runner, and also fans like filmmakers who, Guillermo del Toro and Frank Darabont and other filmmakers who were fans of the film, to talk to them about Blade Runner's importance and kind of geek out with them on camera. So it was kind of a dream project, and so Blade Runner's always had a special place in my heart. And I was really lucky and fortunate to get to explore this film, but with such a great sort of fun but immersive deep dive of a project to work on.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking as you're saying that, there's sort of a correlation between you or other film historians who are researching and looking for materials. There's sort of a correlation to collecting and collectors who are sort of trying to track down these artifacts. Like I'm sure for you, it was a great moment just to get that access to say, hey, here's everything that exists from Blade Runner. Go start digging through boxes that no one's looked at for decades. I mean, that must have been fantastic.
No, it was. I mean, it took a while for the legal wrangling to happen, but once we actually got access to all of the film elements that still existed from Blade Runner, and by the way, there were pallets upon pallets worth of boxes of negative and visual effects tests and just like everything you can imagine that was on film. All of that stuff had been marked for junk in 1988, I believe, and
Wow.
we got to it in 2001 the first time, and we didn't actually get access to look at it properly until about 2006. So just imagine, for all those years from 1988, that stuff was on death row. That stuff could have been thrown out and destroyed at any point. And because someone never got around to it, someone never signed the final order to destroy all of that gold, we got access to it. And that's why I try to put as much of it as I possibly could on that first 5-disc set that we put out, because what an opportunity and what an enormous sort of treat to share with fans of the film. Because to me it was like Christmas morning every day for the making of the entirety of the making of that project, because there'd be some new discovery every day. And just to, there are things you heard about, but you weren't sure existed, and then seeing it for the first time, things you didn't know about, and finding it, and you're like, oh my God, I had no idea that was an actual thing they shot. So it was just, it was a wonderful, wonderful process, even though it took forever, and it was a lot of hard work for everybody involved. It was a huge crew that worked on it. But it felt meaningful. It felt like we were on the path to something really cool, and it was.
I wanted to start just by talking about the visual aesthetic of Blade Runner as a whole. And obviously, I'm sure people watching this are aware that, it starts with source material, with the Philip K. Dick novel. Can you talk a little bit about any kind of visual sense that exists in that novel, and where Ridley Scott went from there as to the visual aesthetic and the inspiration for the visual of the whole thing?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I read Durandra's Dream of Electric Sheep a few months before the movie came out, because I had heard about the film and I was very curious about it for a number of reasons. But I thought, well, I'll read the book. And I read the book, and all that at the time visually that existed were maybe a few stills in magazines, and then Drew Struzan's first rough, like, kind of poster comp that he did, which is still my favorite, to be honest. I guess because that was the first movie poster I saw associated with Blade Runner, but that was on the cover of the novel. And so I read the book with that visual in mind. And when you read Philip K. Dick's original, story, it's vaguely like the film. I mean, it's the basics. The basics are still there, but the details are so radically different. And it goes into some really interesting kind of side alleys, narratively speaking, and visually, I had a completely different sort of imagined world reading the book than what would be in the movie eventually. Because when I was reading it, and I know they kind of updated the year that it takes place in, just to kind of update the book over time, but being kind of San Francisco and being a different part of California, and the weather always felt like gray and rainy versus night and rainy. It was just kind of like there was very different visual signatures to the book and then the movie. So when I saw the movie, again, the basic story was approximately the same, but the world was radically different. So it's interesting that I think that the team, Ridley and the art department, probably didn't slavishly, pour over and scrutinize the book, looking for things to dig up for the movie. I think they really kind of started with a blank canvas, using Ridley's imagination and his visual sense. But the book certainly served as kind of like the guide rails, I think, for approximately what the world would be like, not necessarily what it would look like. And that allowed Ridley and the art department to kind of go nuts and kind of create their own world. And I know that Ridley, having directed literally thousands of commercials, he was influenced, I think, somewhat by his time traveling abroad, particularly like Shanghai and Asia, like kind of seeing how those cities were developing, and how kind of beautiful, industrial, exotic, alien, strange they were developing into over that period of time to today even. And then certainly sources like Heavy Metal Magazine or Metal Hurlant, like it was also called, and artists like Mobius, definitely had that kind of used future look going that felt kind of like it took place on another planet, like it took place off world, even though it wasn't in the case of Blade Runner. But it was just it was kind of a gritty used future that Star Wars had certainly capitalized on with its look. And a couple other films, even including Heavy Metal, the movie, the animated movie, definitely dipped into that world slightly before Blade Runner. But I think all those influences kind of came together to create this this anti-2001 future, that I think Kubrick had so beautifully established as this kind of sterile, clean, optimistic, but also kind of mysterious and dark and strange future versus this kind of nitty-gritty, dystopian, dark, rainy, back alley future that Blade Runner represents, with Alien kind of being loosely in between, because Alien has a little bit of 2001 in it and a little bit of Blade Runner. So, it's this ongoing evolution of looks and styles.
And where does the film noir, the detective aspect of it, come into play?
Well, I mean, I think that's certainly there in the original book, because Deckard was, a kind of a bounty hunter in the book, but there was sort of like this sense of the Philip Marlowe, Sam Spade kind of like, I don't know, flavor to it. But I think Hampton Fancher, when he started developing his adaptation of the book into a script, embraced that, because I don't think Hampton was expecting the movie to be so visually grand. He was always talking about it being a small film in rooms, people talking in rooms, being very internal and interior. And Ridley asked the question, what's outside the window? And Hampton was like, I don't care about the window, I care about what's happening in the room. And Ridley was sort of like, well, you have to consider what's outside the window, because that's everything. That establishes a credibility with the audience that you can make replicants, that you can travel off-world, all these things that are kind of in some cases, the periphery of Blade Runner, but in other cases, the core, the heart of Blade Runner, the replicants. You have to prove that that's real and that's something you can invest in. So you need to see the world. You need to see the future. You need to see all this stuff. And that's where it went from kind of like old-fashioned noir, detective noir, to something a bit bigger and grander and more visually kind of, seductive and intoxicating.
Yeah, and I think the wardrobe definitely plays into that noir aspect as well. Obviously, when people think of Deckard, they think of the big, heavy trench coat. And so, we can get into the wardrobe a little bit. It's an interesting thing with Blade Runner, where there were actually two co-costume designers on the film, right? There was Charles Node, who's an English designer, and Michael Kaplan, who's an American designer, both of whom had, quite extensive careers, worked on many films. Michael Kaplan's still working today. Did you get to interview those guys when you did the documentary?
We interviewed Michael Kaplan. Paul Prishman, who was my associate producer on this, he interviewed Michael for the documentary, because I was elsewhere. But we have a really great piece in the 5-disc mega set that came out called Fashion Forward, which is all about the costumes and the look of the characters, which I would encourage people to check out. And Michael goes into detail there about Deckard and his look and the shirts and everything. But I think that, it was such a huge, ambitious project when it came to everything, but especially costumes, that it wasn't, one person couldn't handle it all. So I think you had Charles Node focused on kind of like the big hero costumes, like the iconic kind of main costumes, and then Michael would deal with the rest of the world, but also they'd probably go back and forth on some things. So when we talked to Michael, he brought up this notion of Mexican deco as a style influence that appears not just in the costumes, because there's like sort of like a lot of kind of like tile designs that seems also somewhat influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, that appears on the sets, but it also appears in the costumes. If you look at several of the different outfits, like Tyrell's robe, Deckard's other shirt, there's a sense of this kind of Mexican deco that Michael refers to. And I think that was a heavy influence throughout everything in Blade Runner, not just costumes and sets, but little tiny details of decor throughout, and probably in some of the graphics as well that Tom Southwell designed. So I think that back then on this film and a lot of other films that have become very influential visually, they were pulling from all kinds of very interesting sources. You know, like again, the alien suits, the astronaut suits being kind of samurai looking. You know, I mean, there's a lot of films today go very logically into what we're dealing with now as what is our future, like what is the actual future we're going into. Back then it was so much more imaginative, where they thought, well, we're not sure, so let's go to the past and dig up really strange, interesting, ancient stuff and make it look futuristic. And Blade Runner certainly captured that, using the detective noir thriller as a starting point, but then going into kind of new wave and punk rock and just a lot of different influences that blended together into a very unique visual style.
Yeah, that's sort of fascinating because, just looking like at the shirt that's next to me now, I don't think that I would have taken that away from it. But now that you've said it, now that you've introduced that term Mexican Deco, I can definitely see that in it. And also, one thing that you touched on there that's really interesting is just the correlation between the sets and the costumes and how they have to work together, right? It's all part of a larger puzzle, and I'm sure there were meetings between the costume designers and the production designers, and they're trying to make everything gel so that it works to create that tone and that atmosphere that comes through on film, right?
No, absolutely, and I think again that's one of the strengths of Blade Runner. It's a coherent imagined world. So even though it never really truly existed, you believe it existed because it all makes sense. Even in the things that don't make sense, that makes sense because there's a mystery to these alternate realities that we see in a lot of science fiction films. And Blade Runner's future really held water because every detail of it was considered, was thought about, was almost like fetishized to like the tiniest little details that a lot of movies don't bother with because they're more focused on other things. They have other priorities. And in the case of Blade Runner, the devil really is in the details. It's like there's so many little tiny things layered on top of other little tiny things that it's kind of an endless puzzle.
In your travels and you're working with the filmmakers and that sort of thing, did you see a lot of people that still had relics from this movie?
Not so much from people who worked on the film. I think there's certainly, cast and crew who have chunks of things here that maybe they're just kind of quietly hanging on to or what. I remember, and you might find this interesting, it was like early 80s, like I want to say 83 or 84, and I was at the Rose Bowl swap meet in Pasadena, and there was someone out there that was selling, who was selling Blade Runner artifacts, like costumes and press kits and stunt guns, and like it was weird. It's like their entire stall was almost all Blade Runner stuff, and this is like in early mid '80s.
Real material, things from the movie.
I mean, it had to be because it was so soon. Relatively speaking, it was so soon after the movie had come out and bombed and stuff got auctioned off or thrown away or whatever. And I remember, like this person definitely had like legit studio, like promotional materials and stuff, but it was pretty much all Blade Runner. This guy's entire stall was Blade Runner, and I remember he had a couple costumes. And again, I was just like, I was a kid and I didn't have any money. Like one of my fantasies is to have a time machine, go back to that Rose Bowl and buy everything now because he had a lot of cool stuff. Blade Runner's like prop costume, sort of like the secondary market for all that stuff. Definitely, I think quietly festered for many years. And then when the film itself became popular again, like it had a rediscovery period, then all the stuff kind of came back to the surface because people were like, either proud or they wanted to sell it, make some money or whatever. For whatever reason, there seems to be a resurgence in Blade Runner collectability because the film did better over time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've never heard that Rose Bowl story. The main story that I've always heard is that the wardrobe went out to one of these shops in LA that basically resells studio clothing. And there's still shops like that today, and they're not even necessarily selling it as collectibles in the way that we at Prop Store would. It's more like a liquidation outlet that's just getting rid of wardrobe. And I think there was one in the 80s called the Retake Room, which no longer exists, but I've heard stories before that some of the Blade Runner wardrobe went through the Retake Room in the 1980s, and I believe that's the original source of this shirt. In the interview with Michael Kaplan, did he get into any more specifics that you can recall about the shirts themselves? I mean, the Mexican Deco thing's sort of fascinating, but anything about like why why Deckard goes through the costume changes that he does, why he has the multiple outfits, anything like that?
Well, I don't think it was directly addressed other than that, Deckard has a life, and things happen in life, and he gets beat up, he gets thrown in the street, he goes back to his apartment with Rachel, he takes the shirt off, he changes. So I think anyone that would go through what Deckard did in a pretty short period of time would probably change their shirt at least, because everything else is basically the same. I mean, the trench coat's basically the same. The suit is basically the same. It's just really the shirts and the ties that seem to change over the course of the film, which is great because I feel like, it gives the character a life that you say, oh yeah, he's not just Luke Skywalker wearing the same outfit for 90% of the movie. He's actually a living human being on Earth who has a wardrobe and can change when he gets beat up and gets, he has blood on his shirt and he gets thrown in the street. So that's the only kind of like reasoning I can glean from the Michael Kaplan and certainly Ridley's and everyone's sense of wanting to give the film a true realism beyond the science fiction of it. They wanted it to be like a gritty, down and dirty story, and I think that Deckard, more than a lot of other characters, is the audience surrogate and takes us through this. So he has to show wear and tear, and the shirts reflect that.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I guess it ties into the realism of the whole movie.
Deckard was going to have a fedora of some kind to again tap into that old, detective noir look, and. When Ridley and Michael Dealey went to go meet with Harrison in London when Harrison was working on Raiders, apparently he showed up to the meeting dressed as Indy. And they saw him wearing the hat, and they're like, oh man, we can't do the hat now because he's doing the hat in this. And Harrison said, yeah, I just did a movie with, wearing a hat for 90% of it. I'd rather not do that with this. So that was one strike against the hat. The second thing was the haircut. I don't think they had figured out exactly what to do with his haircut, but Harrison, shortly before shooting, got it chopped pretty punky, pretty close and spiky and all that, like we see him in the film. And I guess that caught everybody off guard because they weren't expecting it. And he basically said, if you don't like it, wait a couple of weeks, it'll grow back. But he had to kind of like reboot his hair from anything previous, whether it was Han or Indy. So that was kind of like his stamp on Deckard. I think was kind of more above the neck than the rest of it. The rest of it he seemed fine with. And not to go into a certain sequel, but it's kind of funny when you compare this to 2049 and like his very, very un-Deckard looking, clothing that he wears.
Very plain.
It's the exact opposite of like the shirt you've got there. So, I'm sure tastes change over time, and I'm sure his feelings about it change over time. But that was kind of it. I think he just didn't want to repeat what he had just done with Raiders.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense because obviously he was so visible in that tight little 3, 4, 5 year run, whatever it was. I mean, to establish 3 of these major characters of cinema, all of whom endure today, obviously Han Solo, Indiana Jones, and Rick Deckard, you can see why that would be a concern. Is like, how do you put some sort of distinction when it's always the same guy? If people want to learn more, where would you send them? Where can they find Dangerous Days?
Dangerous Days is, I believe, on every sort of multi-disc version of Blade Runner: The Final Cut. So if you find like anything more than just the movie, chances are Dangerous Days is on there. So just look at the packaging. But it was, they pretty aggressively skewed that across different like formats and different releases over the years. So it should be on there. It should be on whatever Blade Runner disc you've got, and that's sort of 2007 or after.
Okay, yeah. So if you're interested, it shouldn't be hard to find.
Hopefully. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Charlie. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Brandon. Good luck with the auction.